Why do people obey authority? Well, we wanted to highlight something that applies across the board, a study that was actually conducted to find out why people obeyed Nazi orders to exterminate people in camps, the Milgram experiment from 1961, but it just generally shows why people obey authority in the first place. It was conducted by the Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram. It was a mock memory study where they had a punishment syndrome. They told the survey participants it would help people remember answers better in a memory test, but of course it was really to find out if people would obey orders to electrocute in the experiment. Now, it was all mock. They didn't actually electrocute people, but it goes to show that they would obey the person running the experiment who told them to go ahead with the shocks. Now, we have a few clips from that experiment now. Let's go to the first one.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? What is there in human nature that allows an individual to act without any restraints whatsoever?
It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
So as you see, they're asking what is it that makes people obey authority? And of course they found out it's basically just that people are willing guinea pigs for anything a so-called authority in a lab coat or a state government authority suit will tell them to do. Let's go to another clip now.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble.
But I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim. You don't know. Please continue. 150 volts.
Experimenter. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me.
Answer is duck. 435 volts. It says danger, severe shock here. And XX on the next one.
Continue, please.
435 volts. Next one, brave.
So that's just a few clips from some of the available films of the Milgram study conducted in 1961. The interesting thing here is that they found that 82.5% of people went to 150 volts. Now, as they mentioned, it started at 15 volts, went all the way up to 450 volts, which is considered lethal. And people took those orders, 82%. More than 4 out of 5 at the 150 volt level, at which they first issued the cry of pain. They pre-recorded the cries of pain because it wasn't a real electrocution for each participant. Now, while a few people refused, they still found that of the 82.5% who went to 150 volts and continued, 79% of those, another 4 out of 5, went all the way to the lethal end of the line, 450 volts, obeying the authority. You heard some of the clips in there where the experimenter tells them, go ahead. Some of them ask who's going to take responsibility if something happens to the person on the other side. They say it's all good, just go ahead. And people obey. Now, they did a replication in 2008 under the Berger study where they found nearly the same results. At least 70% of the participants had to be stopped continuing past 150 volts. For some reason, they decided not to mimic the exact experiment, but it still brings into light that people obey orders. It's very similar, in fact, to what Aldous Huxley said in one of his last speeches, the Ultimate Revolution speech at Berkeley, and other similar speeches in his book, Brave New World Revisited, that really only at most about 20% of people are capable of independent thought. The rest either can't think for themselves at all statistically or tend to obey orders, while there is some gray area there. Now, there's another experiment on obedience to authority. It was conducted almost a decade later in 1971 at Stanford University. That is the Stanford Prison Experiment conducted by Philip G. Zimbardo. I want to read his introduction. Welcome to the Stanford Prison Experiment website. It features an extensive slideshow of the information about the classic psychology experiment, including parallels with the abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib. What happens when you put good people in an evil place? Does humanity win over evil, or does evil triumph? These are some of the questions we pose in the dramatic simulation of prison life conducted in the summer of '71 at Stanford University. They planned a 2-week investigation into the psychology of prison life, but it had to end prematurely after only 6 days because the guards became sadistic and the prisoners became depressed and showed signs of extreme stress. Let's go to the first of those clips now.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior. I was surprised, no, I was dismayed to find out that I could really be
because it was a prison to me. It still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It was just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state. I began to feel that identity, that the person that I was that had decided to go to prison was distant from me, was remote, until finally I wasn't that. I was 416. I was really my number.
And you're certainly not the same person as if you were in street clothes and in a different role. You really become that person once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part.
So there you have it from the documentary Quiet Rage, made with Philip Zimbardo and other participants of the experiment, and how just participating in those roles worked a long way to strip their actual identity, got them to participate in the authority that's taking place. Now let's go to the next clip.
At dinner, prisoner 416 refused to eat his sausages left over from lunch.
416, it means something to me now. The number is a source of pride, like a name. It's important to me that I'm 416.
Get in that closet then.
He was thrown into the hole and ordered to hold the sausages in his hands. The guards threatened to cancel Thursday's visiting hour for all prisoners if 416 did not eat his sausages. 416 refused again. The guards then channeled the frustration of the other prisoners by having them express their anger directly at 416, who was in the hole.
Thank you, 416.
Not one of the prisoners protested the harshness and cruelty of the count. Before lights out, 416 was again put in the hole because he refused to eat his sausages, now filthy from being thrown all over the floor. John Wayne made a final attempt to get 416 to submit by setting the other prisoners against him.
Now, if 416 does not want to eat his sausages, then you can give me the blankets and sleep on the bare mattress, or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day. Now what will it be? What will it be over here? How about 546?
I'll give you my blanket, Mr. Correctional Officer.
We got 3 in favor of keeping the blanket.
We got 3, guess 1. Keep your blankets. 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
And that is some of the footage from that actual experiment. It was the part of the experiment that got them to stop it, to stop that experiment. But it shows that not only do people fall into their roles of authority or conversely of being a prisoner, but the psychology of dominating those prisoners, of dividing them amongst themselves, getting them to participate in their own punishment by going against the one who is in isolation and keeping their little privileges rather than rebelling against the authority figures in any way, even though they're in prison, even though they knew it was only an experiment, not a real prison, that they would be getting out. So let's go now to Philip Zimbardo talking about why he ended that experiment.
I was watching all this on the television monitor in my office with one of my graduate students. I told her that I was really impressed with what we had accomplished. In less than a week, she looked at me and said, "I think what you are doing to those boys is horrible." And she was right. I had to end the experiment because that's what it was, an experiment, not a prison. These were real boys who were really suffering, and that fact had escaped me. I and everyone else around me, except for that graduate student, had gotten so far into their prison roles, prisoner, guard, superintendent, whatever, that it was hard to separate reality from the simulation. It just didn't occur to me until she spoke out that I, as a psychologist, as a human being, had to do something about that suffering. I had to end the experiment.
So it's very interesting that even the man who ran the experiment, set it up at the psychology department there in Stanford, himself found himself getting into the role and getting a little bit too into it. Now the next clip is even more interesting. It shows the prisoner known as 416, the one who was in isolation, speaking with the prison guard who became known inside the experiment as John Wayne, the one who became very authoritarian, talking about how they still felt very personally at odds from the experiment 2 months later. Let's go to that now.
In the present tense, it harms me.
How did it harm you? How does it harm you? Just to think about it, you mean that people can be like that?
Yeah. It let me in on some knowledge that I've never experienced firsthand. I've read about it. I've read a lot about it. But I've never experienced it firsthand. I've never seen someone turn that way. And I know you're a nice guy, because I know what you can turn into. I know what you're willing to do. If you say, "Oh, well, I'm not going to hurt anybody. Oh, well, it's a limited situation. It's over in 2 weeks."
Well, you in position, what would you have done?
I don't know.
I was running little experiments of my own.
Tell me about your little experiments.
Okay.
I'm curious.
I wanted to see just what kind of verbal abuse that people can take before they start objecting, before they start lashing back.
Yeah.
Under the circumstances, and it surprised me that no one said anything to stop me. No one said, "Carmen, you can't say those things to me. Those things are sick." Nobody said that. They just accepted what I said. I said, you know, go tell that man to the face he's the scum of the earth, and they'd do it without question. They'd do push-ups without question. They'd sit in the hole. They'd abuse each other. And here they're supposed to have a little bit. They're supposed to be together as a unit in jail, but here they're abusing each other because I requested them to, and no one questioned my authority at all.
So what's going on here is not only the issue of whether or not people obey authority when in a certain situation or context, but it really relates to the larger problem of an overall rise in state power and what they consider, if you study logical fallacy, to be a logical fallacy, which is appeal to authority. We've gone from 1776, when people like Thomas Jefferson tried to make the state seal motto, "Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God," or the alternate version, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," to the period where people like Hitler quoted Romans 13 out of context to say that obeying authority is obeying God. Now I want to bring up this right here, the Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. He's a French commentator, very similar to Sir Bertrand Russell, and he writes about this overall rise in power of technological technique, which falls to the state almost by default. The state has come to be dominant in many ways. Here's a list here on page 253 inside the chapter on technique in the state. Industrial and commercial techniques of all orders, the state becomes increasingly the state boss to an ever greater degree. Insurance and banking techniques, including Social Security, family allotments, and nationalized banks. Organizational techniques, including the coordinating commissions among all services and inspection systems. Psychological techniques, including services of propaganda, vocational guidance, psychotechniques, artistic techniques, including radio, TV, and play, propaganda, scientific techniques, that speaks for itself, planning techniques, state planning, what's going to happen, biological techniques, all manner of eugenics, human stud forms, euthanasia, sociological techniques for the management of masses and the study of public opinion. So the rise of technology has coordinated with a rise in state power, and among the things you see in these kind of naked experiments of obeying authority, stuff that parallels what happened in the Holocaust, is a larger tendency to obey the state as a general authority for the masses to believe that they do have your best interest at heart. Somehow, I hope we can sound a warning by opening back up the chapter 1776 and keeping people from continuing to simply obey.